Hey, RetconRaider here, and welcome back to another video about Fallout Van Buren. Last time, I talked about the game mechanics that would have been featured in the Fallout sequel that was cancelled in 2003, but this time I thought I'd shine some light on the main storyline. Van Buren would have started in the year 2253, 176 years after the end of the world, and just 11 years after the canonical ending to Fallout 2. It took place in the Great Midwest Commonwealth, geographically situated over 4 states, in an area that spans roughly 750 square miles in size. The player's character would have been known as the Prisoner. Although much of the prisoner's backstory was left up to the player's imagination, one thing that was set in stone was that they had run afoul of the new California Republic and had been imprisoned as a result. The player would have been able to determine whether their PC had actually committed the crimes that they were accused of, as well as the nature of these crimes, which would have influenced the player's starting attributes and may have influenced the story later in the game. However, regardless of the crimes the PC did or didn't commit, they would start the game waking up in a mysterious new prison, an entirely automated pre-war prison known as the Tibbetts Prison Facility. The player would have no idea how they had gotten there, and shortly after waking up, the facility would come under attack by a group of soldiers led by an unknown man, who would later be identified as Viktor Presper, a rogue NCR scientist. The attack would blast a large hole in the side of the prison, damaging many of the facility's robotic caretakers. As automated security systems activated, the player would have no choice but to flee for their life. Escaping into the wastelands, they would be left with numerous questions to answer. How did they end up in that mysterious prison? Who were those people who attacked? And most importantly, what were they supposed to do now? One thing would quickly become abundantly clear. The prison wanted the prisoner back. Shortly after the opening, the player would discover that they were being pursued by a massive fortress-sized robot known as Argos. This robot was the primary enforcer and recovery agent for the Tibbetts Prison Facility, tasked with recapturing all of the prisoners who escaped during Viktor Presper's attack. Fortunately for the player, Argos was damaged during the attack, making him slow and more than a little glitchy. The player would have been able to reasonably stay ahead of him on the world map, and even if Argos did catch up with the prisoner, it would just drag him back to the prison and drop him off in an already breached section of the facility, meaning the player could just walk back out again, and Argos would start chasing them all over again. Initially, the player's primary goal would be to wander the wasteland looking for information specific to their situation, while trying to avoid Argos and other agents of the prison. Eventually, they would begin to learn some very troubling information. The Tibbetts Prison Facility was being operated by an artificial intelligence known as Odysseus, which was simply attempting to maintain a quarantine zone to protect the rest of the region. You see, it would turn out that all of the prisoners it was holding were wastelanders who had recently been infected with a mutated strain of the New Plague, a pre-war disease that had once ravaged the countryside. Now let's pause for a quick fictional history lesson. The New Plague was introduced back in the original Fallout title. Also known as Limit 115 and the Blue Flu, the New Plague was a disease that initially caused flu-like symptoms, but resulted in death just a few days later, and survivors of the disease were generally rendered impotent. The New Plague had originally been developed by the Shadow Government, later known as the Enclave, as a biological weapon for use against the enemies of the United States. However, in 2052, it was stolen by Chinese spies and accidentally unleashed on the people in Denver. It rapidly spread across the country, killing over 200,000 people and leading to a nationwide quarantine in the years leading up to the final war. This is a very important part of the Fallout lore because it is what led directly to the development of the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, the source of many of the mutants in the Fallout universe, including the iconic super mutants that served as antagonists in many of the Fallout titles. But, for what it's worth, the FEV also successfully stopped the New Plague the first time around. Now, let's get back to Van Buren. The prisoner would quickly discover that not only was the New Plague back, but they were actually infected with it. Argos was pursuing them because it was attempting to keep the entire region from being infected. Unfortunately, it would already be too late to prevent a widespread outbreak of the New Plague, every location visited by the player or the other escaped prisoners was already infected. But the AI at the Tibbetts prison facility didn't know this. The AI would be singularly focused on recovering the escapees, 7 in total counting the player. It would become vital for the player to find a way to analyze and possibly treat the new plague to prevent a new extinction-level event from wiping out all humanity on the continent. The primary source of information would be within the Tibbetts prison facility itself, but the facility would be on high alert until all 7 prisoners were returned. This would give the player their first main goal in the game, capturing all 6 of the escaped prisoners and then returning with them to the prison, so Odysseus would end its alert status. Recovering these 6 prisoners would give the player an excuse to wander the world map, visiting many of the game's colorful locations and giving them a chance to do some world building as they dealt with the various factions they met. But the player would effectively be on 2 time limits. First, the infection would continue spreading, slowly killing off every location the player visited until a cure was found. Second, Odysseus would slowly be rebuilding its forces, harassing the player with larger and larger groups of robots. Once the prisoners had all been captured and returned to the prison, it would be possible for the player to further infiltrate the Tibbetts facility and confront the AI. At this point, however, the player would discover the true antagonist of the story, Viktor Presper, the man who attacked the prison during the game's opening, and who, it turns out, was also the man who started spreading the new plague in the first place. It would be revealed that Viktor Presper was a former scientific advisor to President Tandy, the former leader of the New California Republic. Disillusioned by the direction the NCR started taking after Tandy's death in 2248, Viktor became determined to rid the world of what he saw as chaos and human impurities. A brilliant scientist, he discovered samples of Limit 115 in an old military facility and decided to use them to help purify the planet. This would put the player at direct odds with Presper's agenda. While the prisoner would no longer be hounded by Odysseus or the prison's endless supply of robots, they would now instead have to contend with Presper's minions, who were intent on making sure that the scientist's apocalyptic vision of the future came to pass. Curing the disease would no longer be enough, because Presper had a backup plan. Spreading the disease had only been the first part of his grand scheme. It was intended to deliberately goad Odysseus into enacting quarantine procedures because he knew the AI had a direct link to one of the few remaining satellites in Earth's orbit. A satellite known as Ballistic Orbital Missile Base 1, or BOM-1, which was still holding a full complement of pre-war nuclear missiles. Part of the AI's quarantine procedure included activating this satellite and putting it on standby, just in case of a catastrophic infection scenario, in which case the missiles could be used to cleanse the infected region. While the player was recovering the other escaped prisoners, Presper had already found his way up to the satellite, where he had succeeded in refitting it so that he could instead guide the missiles to strike targets of his own choosing. Now the game would become a race against time as the player tried to find a way to reach the satellite and stop Presper before he could rain destruction from the skies. The player would need to find a way to get into space, which would eventually lead them to the Grand Canyon, where BOM-2, another orbital missile platform, had crashed to Earth decades earlier. The player would be able to salvage information and resources from the crashed satellite, which they could then use at the ruins of the Bloomfield Space Center to repair a spaceship and infiltrate BOM-1. This would lead to the game's final confrontation between the player and Viktor Presper. In the end, the player would have to decide what course to take. Would they buy into Presper's vision of a new, better world? Or would they instead put an end to Presper's plan, neutralizing the scientist and stopping his missiles? Or perhaps the player would use those missiles to settle some grudges of their own, turning them against the NCR or anyone else they felt had wronged them. Regardless of their decision, this would have marked the ending of the main storyline for Van Buren. And given the circumstances, it would have been a very final ending. Unlike in Fallout 2, it seems very unlikely that Van Buren would have allowed the player to continue wandering the wastelands after the end of the game. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, there seems to be a general misconception about the storyline in Van Buren. You see, Fallout New Vegas, developed by Obsidian and published under Bethesda as an official spin-off title in 2010, was handled by several of the key designers who also worked on the Van Buren project. The developers at Obsidian did take some clear inspiration from the cancelled Fallout game when they were writing New Vegas, but for the most part, the events in New Vegas would have taken place after the events of Van Buren. In many ways, New Vegas represents the storyline that would have been featured in the version of Fallout 4 that Interplay was originally planning, but which was cancelled while still in the pre-development phase. So, what material from Van Buren was recycled for use in Fallout New Vegas? Well, let's take a quick look. While the main storyline for Van Buren is largely untouched in New Vegas, some of the side stories were indeed recycled. Most notably, the conflict between the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel, as well as the looming conflict between the NCR and Caesar's Legion. But the main difference is that, in Van Buren, these conflicts were intended for use as side quests and a build-up to the next game, with the primary focus of Van Buren being the containment of the new plague and Viktor Presper's apocalyptic scheme. Geographically, Van Buren and New Vegas take place in almost completely different regions, only sharing a narrow sliver of land on the westernmost edge of Van Buren's world map. The only main location the two games would have had in common was the Hoover Dam, and that would have been portrayed in two very different fashions. In New Vegas, it was a military asset at the center of a three-way power struggle, whereas in Van Buren it was portrayed as a worn-down settlement inhabited by mutants. Similarly, certain other elements of Van Buren inspired content seen in New Vegas, but often with significant changes. The Old World Blues DLC, for example, drew inspiration from some elements of Van Buren's Tibbetts prison facility, but it drew just as much inspiration from the Environmental Protection Agency that was cut from Fallout 2 and certain pieces of cut content from Fallout 1, such as the lobotomites. Content from the Honest Hearts DLC was also partially drawn from Van Buren, most notably the Blackfoot tribe and Joshua Graham, though both of those elements went through some significant changes. Joshua Graham, for example, was portrayed as being much more violent and sadistic in Van Buren, where he served as a potential companion, but would also regularly goad other NPCs into violent confrontations. In comparison, his portrayal in the Honest Hearts DLC showed him at a point where he had become much better adjusted to his circumstances, and he was far more introspective about his violent past. Another companion that was carried over from Van Buren was Arcade Gannon, the former Enclave operative turned repentant doctor. It appears that Arcade wasn't fully fleshed out in the original design documents for Van Buren, so aside from the most basic concepts about the character, almost everything about him in New Vegas was entirely new material. Beyond that, New Vegas did often name-drop locations or characters that would have appeared in Van Buren, generally in the past tense, as if the events from Van Buren had already happened before New Vegas began. This, combined with the decision to advance the timeline to the point where there was open conflict between the NCR and Caesar's Legion, all seems to indicate that New Vegas was deliberately treating Van Buren as a prequel story. And on that happy note, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. And remember, if you're interested in checking out all 700 pages of the Van Buren design documents for yourself, you can find them at the Fallout Wikis. Links are in the description.